Okay, welcome everyone. It's officially 4 p.m. and we certainly do not have enough time as it is to cover all the topics we're going to want to today. So I'm going to get started. There might be a few people that trickle on in, so just make room for them as they do, please. I also want to note that this event is being recorded, but audience faces will not be visible during the Q&A. So good afternoon and welcome. My name is Sarah Truhl-Roberts, and I serve as the faculty director for the Program for Public Discourse. We are proud to be co-sponsoring this event alongside the UNC Center for Middle East and Islamic Studies and the Carolina Center for Jewish Studies. We are pleased to be joined this afternoon by Claudia Jacobi and Patricia Rosenmeyer, representing the two respective centers. I will be moderating a conversation between two of my colleagues from the Political Science Department, Naven Babbitt, the Dowd Professor of Peace and War, and Jeff Spinner-Halev, the Keenan Eminent Professor of Political Ethics. Our conversation will center on a brief history of the Israel-Palestine conflict, the strategy of the different actors in the Gaza war, and the ethics of war more generally. We'll reserve some time at the end for questions. We simply ask that you keep your questions short and on point so that we can get to as many of them as possible. All right, so we have an hour to cover, a lot of information. I also want to note that we probably have a range of views and knowledge as it comes to this event and this conflict in this room. And so for that reason, I thought we would start with sort of a very brief and albeit not comprehensive history. And so Jeff, I'd like to start by asking you, can you provide some context or situate the current conflict in history and give us a little bit about the region more generally? And then Naven, I'll ask you a little bit more specifically about Hamas, how Hamas came to power.
Okay, hi everyone. I'm going to give a very abbreviated history. There's always a question about when you start the history, 19th century, earlier than that. I'm going to start in 1948. 1948 is the Israel War of Independence. Israel succeeds in its war, and the war creates many refugees. Some are civilians fleeing. Some are pushed out by the Israelis as they take advantage of the opportunity to gain a larger Jewish majority in the state. At the time before the war, Gaza has approximately 80,000 people in it, and then another 150,000 refugees, Palestinian refugees, come into Gaza. Gaza is at this point controlled by Egypt, but it's not incorporated into it's separate. And it is controlled by Egypt up until 1967. In 1967, there was another war. In the war, Israel takes over the Sinai Desert. We don't have a map here. Takes over the Gaza Strip. It also takes over the Golan Heights from Syria, which we won't talk about. But importantly, it takes over the West Bank, which was controlled by Jordan at the time. So at this time, Israel begins a few settlements in the West Bank and later on in Gaza. The number of settlements, Jewish settlements in Gaza, is never very large. And eventually in the early 2000s, they are all abandoned. The settlements in the West Bank start to increase after 1977. This is when Menachem Begin takes power. He is part of the Likud party, which is the same party as the current prime minister of Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu, for various reasons, some security reasons, but some people in the party have a vision of a greater Israel, which would include the West Bank. The West Bank has now approximately 2 or 2.5 million Palestinian residents. I will return to the West Bank later on. So the Gaza Strip is now controlled by Israel, but after the 1990s, and I'm about to hand off to Naven, it has a border both with Israel and then another border with Egypt. And so it's surrounded by both countries, and both countries restrict movement in and out of the Gaza Strip.
That's great, thank you. Maybe if you would hand it over to Naven, and can you add any context additionally to that you would like, but then also speak a little bit more specifically about the role of Hamas and how Hamas in particular came to be prominent in the Gaza region?
Sure, so I want to emphasize that in the events of the Israeli War for Independence, this is called the Nakba by the Palestinians, and it was a moment, it was a terrible moment where Palestinians were in a sense moved off their land, and the land was confiscated by those that would become the state of Israel. So it's a long moment that's looked at as a moment of humiliation. And it's something that's remembered. And since there are refugees that have been pushed out of that area, that have left that area, there's always been a central tenet to try to bring those individuals back, or at least their families back, given that this was, according to the Palestinians anyway. So again, to step a little bit back, the British, upon leaving the area, made, or before they left the area, made dual promises to both the Jewish population and to the Palestinians, both proclaiming that they would have their own state in these areas, and that was never fulfilled. So when the war happened, from the Palestinian perspective, the belief was that, in a sense, this was colonization all over again, that the Europeans were telling them that some of this land was not theirs, even though they believed it was theirs. So that was, again, that was a moment of great humiliation. So after the war, as Jeff said, that we had Palestinians that were pushed into the West Bank, we have Palestinians that were in the Gaza Strip. After the 67 war, those areas were taken over by the Israelis. In a sense, the Palestinians became a peoples without a state, right? So they had no representation. They were under military rule. And in the case of, and for the case of the Palestinian Liberation Organization, led by Yasser Arafat, they start to stage guerrilla war against the Israelis. They were chased out of Jordan. They were then chased into Lebanon, where they were then attacked by the Israelis as part of the Lebanese war. As this was happening in Gaza, there was a group that was known as Hamas that came about. It had its origins throughout Egypt. It started to emerge, and it emerged as a charity, as a social charity. It still has a political wing and a social wing, and a military wing. And at first, Israel didn't have a problem with Hamas. It actually looked at Hamas as being something that could, in a sense, weaken its adversary of Fatah. It did not see Hamas as a particular challenge, but over time, Hamas grew in terms of its popularity, and especially because it was something that was not Fatah, which was looked at as terribly corrupt. So Hamas then it emerges in 1987. In 1988, it passes its charter, which calls for the destruction of Israel. Since that point, it has rejected the Oslo Accords, which were the agreement that tried to set up a dual state, or a state for both the Palestinians and the Israelis, but they never said they were totally against this idea. They've actually seemed to have moderated a little bit, at least in some of their documents. So it's not the case that, or at least I don't know, I don't speak for them, but it's not the case that they've totally rejected this idea, but they've always sort of held this idea that since this territory was taken from them. And that's something, again, to remember if we're looking at how they analyze the situation. It's one from loss, and it's one, particularly from Haas's case, they're looking at it in a situation of weakness.
Great, thank you, thank you. Jeff, do you want to follow up on any of that, or I can go on to the next question, which is going to be more specific.
Yeah.
Okay, so given that you teach a class on the ethics of war, I was hoping you could tell us a little bit about the ethics of war in this particular context and the situation. What are sort of the rules of war, the rules of engagement, and what kind of latitude is given both to Hamas, but also to Israel?
Right. So let me begin by saying that I knew nothing or very little about the ethics of war about 5 years ago. And then Navin told me that he needed someone to teach the course in PWAD. And so I've since spent a lot of time learning about the ethics of war and have taught the course several times. Some of you may have had me in the class, perhaps. Yes. So, so for you, I'm probably going to repeat myself. So there's two pieces of the ethics of war, which are in Latin: jus ad bellum and then jus in bello. Jus ad bellum is the war just, and then jus in bello is the conduct of the war just. Okay, so you can be attacked and then attack the other state, and that can be a just war, but you may do so. Whether you do it in a just way or not is a different question, right? So there is whether the war is just, and then the conduct of the war itself. So, for example, I'm very sympathetic to the Ukrainians in the war against Russia, but when they use cluster bombs, then I start to worry that they're violating the rules of war, even though their cause is just. Okay, so Israel is, of course, attacked by Hamas, killing civilians, purposely killing civilians, and I will get to the nuance of this a little more. Killing civilians on purpose is always wrong according to the ethics of war, right? You can't aim for civilians and kill them. And so what Hamas did, which was kill, rape, brutalize, all of that is against the ethics of war. I do want to say that to call people settler colonialists as a justification is not a justification on the count of ethics of war, and I don't think ethical in any scheme, because there There are many settler colonialists. If you buy that term, that framework, there are many settler colonialists across the world, including most everyone in this room today, right? And so that justification fails on many grounds. So I do want to say that what Hamas could have done in the bounds of the ethics of war is attacked, which it did, the army bases of Israel. And while Israel, of course, would have reacted very angrily, that would not have violated the ethics of war, right? Even if you think they're just cause, whether you think they had a just cause or not, attacking soldiers, killing soldiers, taking them as prisoners of war would be acceptable under the rules of war. Taking civilian hostages is not acceptable under the rules of war. So let me also say that all of Hamas missiles, if they're not aimed at military installations, if they're just aimed at population centers, is also against the rules of war, right? Each missile, and there's thousands, is against the rules of war. All the missiles from Hezbollah that are sent over to, which is in the north, on Lebanon, we didn't talk about Hezbollah, but there's Hezbollah, which is the north of Lebanon, all their missiles that come over, if they're not aimed at military installations or military targets, which are most of them, are also against the rules of war. You could say, if you wanted, each missile is a war crime, but taken together, it's not allowed. All right, so what can Israel do? Israel views this as what they call in Israel an existential threat. They view this as a threat that the state, well, whether the state can actually exist, okay? So you have what Hamas did, which was a big attack, killing 1,300 to 1,400 people. You have Hezbollah throwing missiles, and now you also have this group in Yemen, also a few missiles coming from an Iran group in Yemen, and then of course Iran is around. So Israel can defend its borders. It can attack Hamas. Israel first said it wanted to eliminate Hamas. That seems to be an unfeasible war goal. It can degrade Hamas if it wants. And this will mean inevitably that civilians will die. This is particularly true because the battlefield is an urban area. And while Hamas does hide itself among civilians, and that does put more civilians at risk, it's not as if Hamas is going to just be in the center of Gaza altogether and say, here we are. I mean, so it is going to be a complicated situation, and Hamas might bear some of the moral blame of the civilians dying.
Can I just ask a quick follow-up on
sure.
this? So as far as the crimes of war, right? And you talked about missiles toward Palestinians that are attacking civilians directly, and that's a war crime. Maybe each individual missile is a war crime. Would the same be true in Israelis' response to
Each
the
missile?
attacks? Yes.
So the missiles have to be aimed toward a military target.
Okay.
Right. And then there's become a question about what if it's a military target, but they kill some civilians.
Right.
And so let me get to that in a minute.
Okay. Perfect.
But I will. So Israel must take care to not kill civilians. The old standard was you must intended to not kill civilians, but that's insufficient because you can drop a bomb and say my intent is to get that Hamas guy on the ground. And the fact that I killed 100 civilians, oops, I'm sorry about that. That's not good enough. You actually have to take purposeful action not to kill civilians, okay? You have to try to reduce the number of people that you kill who are not military combatants. You also cannot engage in collective punishment. So I'm gonna get back to the civilians. So when Israel cut off water and cut off electricity, that is collective punishment, and that is not allowed, right? You're harming the civilians of Gaza. Not allowing humanitarian aid into Gaza is collective punishment. And the idea that we're going to do this until Hamas releases the hostages is not acceptable for the rules of war or ethically, because you are punishing people who don't have the power to do anything about it, right? And Hamas is not going to give in to that pressure. For whatever reasons you want to imagine, they are not going. So you're punishing civilians. Okay. So let's talk about firepower, and so on and so forth. So I'm gonna talk about it in terms of proportionality. We read a lot about proportionality in the news and what's proportionate. A lot of it is wrong. I'm going to tell you how to think about it. I'm
Can you
going
make sure that you define that for?
Yes, I will. And I'm going to tell you the proportionality is two things. It's absolutely crucial to understand, and it is inherently ambiguous. Sorry. So.
I tried, what can I say?
Those of you who've taken my class know I say this time and time again about proportionality. Okay, so the first thing is, there's two ways I'm going to talk about proportionality. One is your response has to be proportionate to the threat. Okay, so if the threat is minor, right? Some people throw 2 missiles over to you and they have limited capacity. You cannot go and kill thousands of people because of that, right? The threat is minor. If the threat is large, like thousands of missiles come in and hundreds or over 1,000 people die, and there's 2 or 3 military actors at you, that is an attack that you are able to respond to with full force, right? You know, so the proportionality is what kind of force can you, so it's not about numbers, right? Just because Israel kills more people itself is not necessarily decisive, right? Because it's proportionate to the threat. All right, now let me talk about proportionality in a different way, which is about killing civilians versus killing Hamas commanders, right? So you see a Hamas commander, you say we're going to get him with a bomb, right? And we're going to kill 1 civilian with that bomb, 1 to 1. You're going to think, okay, that's pretty good, right? Like you'll accept that ratio. Many of you will, may not. But what if it's 300 civilians you're going to kill for that 1 Hamas guy, right? Then a lot of us are going to think, well, that seems disproportionate, right? That seems like. So then in your mind, you can then, you know, go from each side. So from the extremes, we're going to agree. This is why that's where it's non-ambiguous. But then you can go, what if you kill 5 civilians? What if you kill 200 civilians? What if you kill 100 civilians? And you can keep on moving from each direction, right? And then what's going to happen is different people are going to have different responses about that exact number. And in fact, there was recently a study done where they surveyed all these philosophers who are experts in the injustice of war, and they gave them scenarios, and they all disagreed on the numbers, right? And so that's why it's inherently ambiguous, because we can't give you an exact number, right? So if Israel is bombing and bombing and bombing for weeks on end, which it seemed to, it would seem very likely that it is disproportionate. In other words, it's disproportionate to the war aims, the number of civilians they're killing, right? And this is different than proportional to the threat, right? It does have a right to go in and take out Hamas if it wants to, but it can't do so by killing an excessive number of civilians, particularly if it is only for small war gain, right? For only if it doesn't have a large military. Okay.
Can I go over to Naven then for a minute, and we can obviously follow back up on this.
Yeah. Can I say one more thing?
One more thing.
One more thing.
One more thing.
I know I'm going over.
You're not going over, but I know there's going to be questions. And
Yeah. So I also want to say that, so I've criticized Hamas. What Hamas did was terrible, against the rules of war. Israel has a right to defend itself, but it's doing things in such a way that's causing excessive civilian casualties. I also want to note that on the West Bank, Israel is not restraining the settlers, and this is kind of outside the rules of war about this war, but the settlers are engaging in what I would consider to be terroristic activity, and the government ought to be restraining. I can take questions on that.
That's great. That's actually a really good point to make before you hand the microphone over to Naven, because I was hoping, again, that being an expert on terrorism, that you could speak a little bit about what Hamas was trying to do, right, in its attack, and then also maybe following up now on Jeff's comments and related to the West Bank in particular.
Sure. So to echo some of what Jeff said, if you've had my terrorism course before, this will be slightly repetitive. But so I think going back to what Jeff is saying, that if you look at terrorist groups, they are non-state actors. And under the rules of the international system, non-state actors have no standing to use violence, right? States are supposed to be the monopolists on legitimate force. So a non-state actor is technically not supposed to do this at all. So the question is, why would we see that? Well, typically, when we look at terror, the use of violence against civilians, that's an act of weakness. So if a group were strong, what they would do is attack military installations, destroy the military installations, conquer them, and take control of a territory for themselves, right? That would be the obvious way to end a conflict quickly. Terrorist groups don't do that. And a big part of the reason is, if we look at terrorist groups in the data, they don't harm a lot of people. The people that they kill, and certainly in this case, this is an abnormal terrorist attack. It's very large, and a lot of people were harmed and killed and still are being harmed. So I don't want to minimize that. But if we look at the number of people killed by terrorists annually, it's not a very large number, and it certainly doesn't compare to some other threats out there in the world. And they also don't last very long. They typically last between 4 to 10 years on average. So they tend to collapse. So these groups don't tend to accomplish what they want to accomplish. So that's an important thing to remember. They're in this position of weakness. So because they're in that position of weakness, that's why they tend to turn violence against civilians, which are the most vulnerable target. So one question is, what are they hoping to do with that? Well, by turning violence against civilians, what the goal is to essentially provoke. You're not going to win a war. You're not going to liberate a territory. You're not going to conquer any territory by killing civilians. The goal is to try to engage in provocation, is to try to induce a state to engage in a massive overreaction. And part of the reason that works is because terrorist organizations melt into populations. You can't distinguish who they are. They don't wear uniforms typically. So you don't know who is a terrorist and who is not a terrorist. If that happens, the goal is to provoke an indiscriminate response from a government. And the reason that works is because most terrorist groups, one of the reasons they're so weak is that they have what is called a free rider problem, where people have incentives to join and not do anything and not participate and not try to engage in any violence. So the groups tend to fall apart on their own. But if they're able to provoke an indiscriminate attack, that takes away that incentive to free ride. It takes away the incentive that people may have to actually just do nothing, right? Now they are forced, maybe through no decision of their own, to try to engage in some active resistance, given that they're being indiscriminately targeted. So I think what Hamas was likely trying to do here is that they were under pressure. Actually, there was some opinion data taken out of Gaza before the conflict, which indicated their support was actually in decline. So they
Support being Hamas's support.
Hamas's support from those in Gaza was in decline. And that's understandable. Like Palestinians in Gaza had lived for a long time behind a wall effectively. They'd been vulnerable. So their political support was in decline. And so if that's the case, one thing Hamas might have tried to do, and it looks like they planned this for some time, is to engage in a significant attack to try to, and it was on the anniversary of the Yom Kippur War, to try to engage in a large symbolic act of violence to try to provoke the Israelis into an indiscriminate response. And I think that's according to them. Again, if I were to ask Hamas, which I have not, but if we were to ask Hamas, I would say this has been, according to their definition, successful. They've been able to provoke the Israelis into a big response. Israel is likely now turning several people in Gaza that might have been inclined to support the two-state solution, which is what that opinion poll indicated that most Gazans did support. Most of them may turn against that now, just given that they are vulnerable and they're being attacked. So I think under those dimensions, it looks like Hamas has accomplished what it wanted.
Great, thank you. Yeah, please.
So I think also, and Niv and I have discussed this, it may have wanted, I think purposely, Nathan thinks not purposely, but it doesn't matter. It may have wanted to undermine Israel's alliances with an increasing number of Arab states around. And it certainly has weakened and put those new bilateral or new alliances under the test. The other thing is, I think Hamas thought by taking hostages, it would have restricted Israel's response in some way. Because a few years ago, it took one hostage, Gilad Shalit, and eventually, after 5 years, traded Gilad Shalit for 1,500 Palestinian prisoners. And so I think they thought this would limit the response in some. There'll still be a big response, but maybe not exactly how it happened.
Great. Can you go back to the West Bank, Naven, and speak a little bit about how you see the conflict over there, paralleling or adding to what's going on in Gaza right now?
Sure. So before I talk about it, I'll just give you the definition of terrorism as political scientists tend to define it, which is a politically motivated attack against non-combatant targets for the purposes of influencing a group beyond the immediate victim. So it's a long term, but what it means is that you attack civilians. The goal is not just to engage in homicides. The goal is to try to influence other people by virtue of your actions. And you have to do that for a political, in a sense, for political means. And so in Gaza, if that's what's happening, I do think you can make the case that those, or at least also in the West Bank, that many there, how they would look at this is that it's true there are those groups that engage in terrorism, but also they're in a case where they would look at this as systemic violence by the state. Right, they are constantly under siege, that the state is building these settlements, that there's no acknowledgement that they're even there. To go back to Jeff's point, what's interesting is that it's true one consequence of this is that some of the international alliances and the agreements that Israel was trying to negotiate have fallen apart. But many of those states actually have never really done much for the Palestinians to begin with, right? So they haven't really been very supportive of the Palestinians. And so what this did is basically bring the Palestinian issue back to the center, which in a sense is a shaming exercise. So I would say from the Palestinians' perspective, they might look at the state of Israel as a state that's engaging in violence against them and perhaps against terrorism against them. There's a different way of categorizing violence in the West Bank, right? So depending on who does it. So that's an important thing, that this definition of terrorism doesn't allow states to be terrorists, right? By definition, academic talk takes that off the table. But if we look at the behavior, right, we can see some activities by settlers that really do resemble that definition.
Thank you. Thank you. So just a little, I'm gonna ask you to speculate a little bit, but I think it's an important conversation and one of interest to people in this room. But what's next? What do you see going forward? Jeff? Yeah. You're both gonna answer the question.
Yeah, we're both gonna answer it. So what's next? This is a good question because I'm not completely sure. And that's the honest answer. I'm not complete because I'm not really sure what Israel's end game is, right? And how they would like the conflict to actually end and what's their sort of final objectives. What's stated is that they want to destroy Hamas. But again, if we follow what we know from theory about terrorist organizations, engaging in acts of indiscriminate violence, it could destroy Hamas, but more likely than not, it will not, right? More likely than not, that's not going to be successful. So Hamas will continue to exist in some form, especially because as they melt into the population. So I'm not sure what sort of the end game is there. I will say that the longer the violence goes on, the harder it makes it for Israel to sustain its international partnerships in the Middle East. So Israel was interested in trying to form a deal with Saudi Arabia. I don't think that's a deliberate reason why Hamas did this, but this is going to be a casualty, I think, of what's happening. So it's going to be harder for Israel to sustain its foreign partnerships. I think for the United States, it's also going to be harder for the United States to sort of justify the continuation of this violence. Day by day, what you're seeing we're now at 10,000 fatalities in Gaza. Day by day, you're seeing Israel's losing some of its international support. So this is just going to be harder and harder for the Israelis to sustain. And I don't know what the end game actually is strategically.
It's a great point. I think we've decided that the room is full, so they're listening. Thank you.
Right. Okay. So, let me just state at the outset that I'm a critic of the current Israeli government and previous the good Israeli governments. I want to distinguish between being a critic of a government and critical of the state existence. It's two different things, right? I was critical of the Trump presidency, but not critical of the state existence of the United States. And so I want to make that distinction very clear. And I am a critic of the Netanyahu government. And I think one of the problems we're seeing is they actually never had a plan for the Palestinians. So the phrase in Hebrew for taking care of Gaza, I'm not sure if you heard this, was called mowing the lawn. Okay. And what this means is every so often, Hamas will throw some missiles a lot of missiles into Israel. It'll get belligerent in some way. And then Israel will go in, do some destruction, mowing the lawn, and then it grows back. Okay. So that's a short-term strategy. It is not a long-term strategy. And I don't think Israel really had a long-term strategy for the West Bank or for Gaza. And I think right now, and it's incumbent on it to have one. So let me say, I don't think this particular government is capable of doing it. But my hope is that this government will fall. I don't think it's going to fall that quickly because the coalition partners they all know that they don't have any electoral support. And so if they leave the government, they won't get reelected. But hopefully it will fall at some point, and then we can see a future where the West Bank somehow becomes the nucleus of a viable and contiguous Palestinian state, and Gaza, probably initially under some kind of international supervision, will then at some point rebuild and then join, not in a contiguous way, or maybe with a road, maybe not a tunnel, joining both things. But that's a vision. I don't think the Netanyahu government really knows.
Well, that sounds like a long-term vision.
Yes. You want to know like
Yeah,
6 months from now?
I think there's a lot of desire to have a sense. I mean, to Navin's point, though, there might not be, but where are we going? What are we doing for civilians? Going back to the ethics of war and humanitarian aid, and what are next steps that should be advocated for, endorsed, et cetera, by other even state governments?
Yeah, so at some point, international pressure, mostly American pressure on Israel will get to the point where it has to stop the war. The problem with saying eradicating Hamas as your end goal is that that's a continuous war, right? And so that's not viable. So at some point, the United States says to Israel, you must stop. And then there is some attempt to rebuild Gaza. I think Israel will insist that there is certain kinds of protections in Gaza. I mean, Gaza is not that big, but it's clearly going to want some buffer between Gaza and Israel. I don't know exactly how that works. They're going to want some assurances that Hamas will not be able to rebuild again. And so I think even now they're going to want Gaza under some kind of international protectorate. I think that's all possible to think about over the next few months. I also think that's temporary. Like I don't think that's not a sustainable long-term solution.
Yeah, David, I would love your thoughts on this as well, sort of where you see things going and.
Yeah, I would agree. That's not a long-term solution, right? And it's going to be difficult to convince people of Gaza that they should give up more of their territory for a buffer, right? Especially because again, Gaza is a very small territory. It's very small, so to ask them to give up more
A lot of people.
with a lot of people, right? Over 2 million people in that very small territory, it's going to be hard to ask them to sort of surrender more territory. I'm sort of less optimistic. I mean, again, I'm not sure Jeff was optimistic at all, but just I think, again, an important thing to bear in mind is that there was support in Gaza for the two-state solution, which was largely what Jeff articulated, right? Again, this idea that the 67 borders are what should be respected. From the Palestinian perspective, that is a compromise, and that's something to bear in mind, right? Because from the Palestinian perspective, they were promised the entire territory. There's sort of an acceptance now that they're not going to get all the territory, just given the balance on the ground. And that the state of Israel is there. And that's no one's going to advocate, not me either, that the state of Israel should disappear, right? It's there. It's been there for a long time. We can have issues with the formation and the Nakba, but I don't think it's going anywhere. So that's something that's there, and that's a realization. So how you get to an acceptance of that, given what's happened, I don't know. I'm not really sure. And what it would require, I think, is as Jeff said, a sort of a change in who is representing, both in terms of Hamas, who's representing the Palestinians, but also in terms of who's representing the Israelis, right? Because we have the government in Israel that doesn't seem interested in any sort of peace or any sort of negotiation. And I said this before, that ultimately both sides have to understand that when you make peace with your adversaries, right? And you make concessions to your adversaries. And that's part of the way you can move forward. And if you're not willing to do that, you'll never have any peace.
Great, thank you. Jeff, anything you want to add on that?
No, I mean,
Okay, so do you have any last concluding thoughts? Because I want to definitely give a good amount of time here as we discuss for questions from the audience. But first, I want to give you an opportunity to say anything else.
Yeah, I just want to talk a little bit about how people frame the conflict and how I want to urge you not to necessarily buy into that framework. So there's a lot of like, are you pro-Israel? Are you anti-Israel? Are you pro-Palestinian? Are you anti-Palestinian? We have polls that ask the question, are you pro-Palestinian or are you pro-Israeli? And I am not pro-Palestinian or pro-Israeli. I'm not anti-Palestinian. I'm not anti-Israeli. Okay. I am for people living in dignity and decency. I am for what Nathan just said, finding ways to negotiate and compromise so we can find that way forward, right? And so I don't like Hamas. Hamas is a group that doesn't seem to have any compunction about killing people. I also think that this current Israeli government, particularly with some elements, are also very problematic in very, very deep ways, right? And so we need people of goodwill on both sides to come together and find a solution. So I'm on that side, right? And I urge you to be on that side also, and not to be pro-Israel or Palestinian. I'm not anti or pro-Slovakia, right? And so, although I don't like the current government, say that. So I don't. If you read about them, it's bad. Really? Yeah, no, they're lying with the Russians. It's terrible. So, but you can make that distinction too between the governments and the people and the state, and that's also very important. So
I think your conversation here this afternoon has showed that there's a lot of nuance, and so it's very hard to dichotomize conflict in the way that we're often asked to do. So I really appreciate those comments. Nathan, do you have anything that you also like to add before questions?
Just to add to that, and a feature of conflict is that you do start seeing things black and white, right? You do start seeing, and your adversary as a block of people that are all opposed to you, right? That's something that
Sure, I would call it a bug, but
maybe it's a bug, but when you get into armed conflict,
I
people do that. So I think the best solution is not to be into armed conflict. Again, to try to avoid these types of things to the best you can. So once you let it out of the bag, once you start these conflicts, it's really hard to resolve these things in this way. And again, we know that most civil wars don't tend to resolve themselves in peaceful ways. They just don't. So that's sort of a depressing anecdote to that. But in this case, nobody's going anywhere. So I think, as Jeff said, it requires people of goodwill to make compromises in good faith and to take risks in good faith, right? And that's something that's just very, very difficult. And to not be absolutist, right? That's extremely difficult, but it's going to be necessary. I fear that these actions right now have kind of poisoned that, if we were going to go with, if it was going to make any progress. But I'm hopeful in the long term, maybe we can get back to that. People of goodwill trying to actually make some compromise.
Great, thank you. I also really appreciate what you said earlier about adversaries, and then it kind of came up there as well. So there's one thing to be an enemy, right? And there's another thing to be an adversary. And those two things are distinct terms, whereas you can have an adversary and you can have, concessions to that adversary as you're negotiating peace agreements or whatever else it might be. But then to label them an enemy, right, completely changes the framework. And so I think that's a really important thing to note in this dichotomization that we do, especially around war and terror, right? The two of you have graciously asked to open the floor up to questions from the audience. So we do have a microphone here that we're going to pass around. And like I said at the beginning, if you could just speak clearly and try to keep your question as concise as possible to allow time for as many questions, that would be excellent. Nora, can you maybe pass the mic down? Is that the best thing to do? I don't think people can walk out.
Yeah.
It's too complicated. So just bring it up to a row and then ask them to pass it down. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Okay, so I feel it's important when we look at the framework for discussing this situation to acknowledge the evil coming from both sides. And I want to pose a question. So the state of Israel has used white phosphorus, which is internationally banned, and has bombed hospitals, right? Do you think that they would do the same? Ooh, damn.
Sorry, I don't know where that came from.
Yeah. Do you think that they would indiscriminately bomb hospitals and churches and children if Hamas was hiding in, let's say, Tel Aviv or any Israeli population?
Sure.
Because there seems to be a complete lack of care for the mass life of Gazans, and their blood is not valued the same way that Israeli blood is valued by the international community.
Great, thank you. Can you pass the microphone back down? And here, actually, I can just pass this one to you then.
Can you hear
Here. Not up here, yeah, they're in the front row, so just hold that.
Okay, hold this.
Yeah.
Do you want to answer? John? I can start.
Thank you.
Sure. Can you all hear me with this?
Yeah.
Okay, good. Okay, so I just want to make sure. So to start with that question, it's very common when you're looking at civil wars or insurgency for populations to separate out. In this case, they are separated by sort of virtue of the way things have moved historically in this region. What's often common is that when you're engaging in violence against an adversary and they're all concentrated in areas, that attacks tend to get more indiscriminate. So I do think that that's sort of something we observe in these types of conflict, that in an area that's populated by Palestinians, if you can view Palestinians all as a collective enemy, it becomes easier to do that. And I share the idea that Palestinians have been vilified collectively, and it's much easier to see them all as Hamas. But I think an important thing to sort of point out is that Hamas is only about 2 to 5% of the Palestinian population. It's not everybody. So if your goal is to eradicate Hamas, collective punishment, as you've described, is probably not your optimal strategy.
Yeah, so
Yeah, just hold it.
yeah, I'm going to give you an unsatisfying answer. So there's a debate among just war theorists about whether you value the civilian lives of your adversary as much as your own. And so some think you ought to, and some suggest that that's not a plausible theory. But in fact, most armies will in fact favor their own civilians over others, which in fact is what happens for usually. But there is this debate that goes on. I'm not going to say much more than that. That's a whole lecture about that. It's a very complicated.
Great, Nora, another question?
There's one here.
Thank you very much. Thank you for your discussion tonight. I have one question for each of you, and I'll be very brief. The first question is for Navin, and you mentioned definitions of terrorism. You mentioned Hamas. I'm curious because it has been put forward by a spokesperson from the Israeli government that Hamas is a terrorist organization like ISIS, like Al-Qaeda, like these other groups we see. But if you read the literature on Hamas, they fashion themselves as a type of national liberation army or a national resistance movement. So could you talk a little bit about the distinction between the kind of terrorism we see when we look at ISIS or Al-Qaeda versus how Hezbollah and Hamas think of themselves, characterize themselves, and then are seen in the literature that you have expertise in? Can I ask my other question very quickly? And the second question is for Jeff. You mentioned this discourse about settler colonialism as outside the bounds of the kind of just war theories of ethics. But if we think of 1948 liberation war as an act of catastrophe or loss from the Palestinian perspective, and we look at what Israeli new historians call, a kind of greater Israel policy that has been the backbone of kind of Israel's ultimate goal since the founding of the state, which is expulsion of Palestinians. Can we limit the current aggression towards Palestinians to the Likud government? Or is there a longer through line in which Palestinian claims to territory have been dismissed and they're never seen as good faith actors given a chance to articulate without entirely dispossessing themselves for the sake of Israeli policies? Thank you.
Okay, so I'll start with the comparison of Hamas to ISIS and Al-Qaeda. So I don't typically like comparing acts of violence because they're all awful, especially for the person that's the victim, right? It doesn't, what I've often found is that it doesn't matter if a person is killed with one gunshot or through a suicide bomb, it's all awful for them, right? They've lost someone that they care about, right? So in terms of the tactics, I'm less comfortable with that. But I will say in terms of the aims, Hamas is quite different than ISIS and Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda and ISIS are really targeting the entire international system. And I don't mean that as sort of they're targeting everybody indiscriminately. The goal is to undo some of the borders that have existed since the Sykes-Picot Agreement in the Middle East. The goal is to undo some of since the Berlin Conference and the decolonization of Africa, right? So those are larger aims that are aimed at fundamentally changing the international system. Hamas is focused mainly on its territory, right, or what it wants to be its territory, and the Arab-Israeli conflict and the area of Palestine. So their aims seem to be much more limited, which is the creation of a Palestinian state. They're not looking for a global redoing of the entire system. Even though this attack, again, was horrific, and it's easy to draw some comparisons for sure, just given how violent it was, but their goal is not that, right? That's something that does, I think, distinguish Hamas from ISIS and Al-Qaeda.
So my comment on settler colonialism was just meant to say that if you view people as settler colonialists, it doesn't mean that you can kill them. I mean, it's just restricted to that. Israeli Arabs or Palestinians in Israel, whichever term you prefer, face a lot of discrimination against whoever has been in charge. There's no question about that. I'm not going to give you a litany. You can just accept my word for it. I would say that what Likud has done differently, it has more aggressively expanded the settlements on the West Bank, much more than Labor has. Which is not to say Labor has not expanded. I'm just saying Likud has been much more aggressive about that. So internally, I don't know that there's been a lot of difference. Palestinians in Israel face a lot of discrimination in all kinds of ways. Interestingly, 20% of the Israeli medical establishment, Israeli medical professionals, are Palestinian. And that's a whole other story that I can tell you about. But there's just been a lot of discrimination. No question.
I guess I just have a question about terms, right? So you open the talk saying that the 1948 war was a war of independence for Israel, which I've never, heard it framed that way. Obviously, the conversation suggests that if you look at it from one side, the framing is very different. But I'd be curious to know in what respect this would be considered a war of independence? And and also kind of in a global sense, how often do we see people who have claims for, separatist aims or nationhood based on their ethnic identity, those actually being recognized by the international community, and granted, legitimized by bodies like the UN and other international powers?
Yeah, sure. So I think it's called the War of Independence. Isn't that what the 40? Yeah, I mean, this is what Israelis call it. It's their War of Independence. Palestinians call it Nakba. I mean, I don't think it's unusual to have two different names for an event. So, yeah, I mean, I think it's called both. I think it just depends on the perspective that you take. I mean, Israel was created in an odd way. I mean, is that what you're asking about? Right. Right. So, I mean, I don't want to give a history of of the creation of the state of Israel. That's a whole other lecture. But it was a war for a independent Jewish state. The UN had a vote. The vote was positive, and then Israel was attacked or also attacked. I'm not going to give you a history of the war. I imagine both things happened simultaneously. And so there was a fight about whether there would be a Jewish state. And so Israel calls it the War of Independence. From their point of view, it was the creation of a Jewish independent state. And as we both mentioned, that also created a lot of Palestinian refugees who were pushed out for various reasons. Yeah, I mean, Israel was created in a complicated way that's not really replicated in in other places. Yeah.
Okay, and I'm gonna invite somebody in up the top. All right, yeah. Thank you.
Okay, maybe you can speak without me.
Thanks. So one thing I remember from Professor Hallop's class was like the topic of intervention. I know there's like a differentiation between humanitarian and military intervention, but I specifically remember acts of genocide possibly justifying or necessitating outside third-party intervention. So two-sided question. One, do you recognize the acts of collective punishment by Israel upon Palestinians as genocide? And two, do you think that might, have implications on the like how the war will play out in terms of other parties possibly intervening?
Um, yeah, right. So the official definition of genocide becomes ambiguous in various ways, and I don't really have it at my fingertips. I'm not an expert on that. And so whether you interpret this as genocide, it depends on how you interpret the vagueness. I mean, it's clearly not a genocide in the case of like the Rwandan genocide or the Armenian genocide or the Holocaust, right? That we have a few thousand people killed, which is terrible. It does not rise to the level of genocide. I do not think Israel did the right thing by attacking just with planes over the first few weeks. But again, I go back to for Israel, this is they view this as an existential threat. That's as plausible as the claim of genocide. And so I don't know how you weigh the two claims. I think that Israel at some point will get more and more international pressure to stop killing people in Gaza. In terms of an intervention, that seems in terms of a military intervention, that seems unlikely. But I think Israel is reaching the limits faster than it should be. So the number of civilians it's killing. Yes.
Do you have anything you want to add to that, David? Yeah.
So I certainly, I understand the point, because again, if we look at the rate of killing in Gaza, it is enormous, right? We've basically had 4 weeks about, right? And we have 10,000 people killed in Gaza, right? Which is an incredible number. As far as calling it genocide, that's it, from my political science mind, that's a very specific term. And again, I'd have to look at the definitions to characterize it. There's another term called one-sided violence, which is when one entity just engages in violence against another population. In this case, it would be hard to characterize it that way, just given the Hamas attack. So there's two parts of that. But I think Jeff is right that the longer this goes on, the more you're looking, the more one-sided it's looking, right? And again, if we just map out fights between Hamas and Israel over time, almost always it's disproportionate, right? Almost always far more Palestinians die than Israelis die, right? So that's just a feature of these conflicts. I don't think there's going to be any intervention at all. I think the U.S. would stop any of that, just because the U.S. traditionally has always supported Israel in these conflicts. So, but I think Jeff is right about a previous point that the minute the United States basically tells Israel to stop, Israel is going to have no choice but to stop. That might take some time, and that's going to take some negotiation, but I think that certainly is a big factor in thinking about this.
Yeah, I want to add that I think Israel made a strategic mistake by starting with bombing. I think it started with bombing because it didn't know what to do. It had a plan to invade Gaza that was on the shelf and that no one updated for several years, and that wasn't really worth it. I mean, that it couldn't use. And so it needed to develop a new plan. And what it should have done, easier to say than to do, is after Hamas attack has done very little, let the horror of those attacks sink into the world's consciousness, even more than it did, and then develop a plan. Not say we're not going to do anything, but then develop a plan that would be effective at rooting out Hamas and minimizing casualties. You know, every good military campaign also has political strategy behind it and a political end goal. And Israel attacked without thinking about the politics. I mean, it responded rather without thinking about the politics. It had a right to respond. A smart response is also political and not just in military terms.
Who's gonna invite somebody from outside?
Hi, thanks so much for holding this event so we can discuss this in community. My question's about transformative justice, so Truth and Reconciliation Commission kind of stuff. I guess I was wondering when you think such an instrument or tool might be brought into this conflict, if ever, and what actors you think might be involved.
David, do you want to start with that one?
I can.
Yeah.
So I don't think we're at a place where that will happen right now, but I think it actually is necessary. And sort of my thought on conflict resolution is always, you need to have truth, you need to have reconciliation. You need to have truth and reconciliation, and you need to have both, right? Both of those things need to be transparent, and there needs to be a common set of facts, right? So just as we've talked today, the War of Independence is called one thing by one side, it's called another thing, it's called the Nakba by the other side, right? There has to be some common understanding of what actually happened. And then when that happens, then we can get to the point where we actually, if there are wrongs on either side, and there's been wrongs on either side, then you're at the point where you can make reparations for that, right? So I do think that that's necessary at some point. I just think that with the conflict right now, it's unlikely to happen at this point, unfortunately.
So I appreciate the hopefulness behind the question, but I don't share it. So at least not right now. So when people are under threat, their best selves do not come out. When people are under threat, and right now Israelis feel under siege and under threat, missiles are coming them from the north, from the south. Iran is orchestrating this. The people in Gaza feel under threat. When people are feeling under threat, they are threatened. The Israelis are threatened. So when people are not just feeling it, when they are threatened, when the threat is real and alive, their best selves to compromise and negotiate are just not on the table. So the first order of business is to get that threat to stop, and then we can think about moving forward.
Hi, I would like to ask about the United States and whether in that oxymoronic term, war ethics, whether within the discussions of war ethics, whether there's any commentary for actors like the United States who are supporting one side in a conflict and their responsibility or limits in that conflict.
So I don't know that there's a direct answer to the question. I think, what we want is the US is a strategic actor. So, I mean, I'm going to give to Nathan in a second. It's going to act out of its interests. It is said that it wants Israel to do so by following international law. And then Israel, Netanyahu rebuked Blinken by saying, until the hostages are released, we're not going to have a humanitarian ceasefire. And so I think that the United States should come down harder. I think it should be more insistent. But in the course of in the kind of course I teach, this kind of particular question doesn't come up.
It's an important one, though. David, you might have thoughts on it.
Sure. Yeah, I can add to it. And so I think what's important in thinking about the question, which I really do appreciate, is that if we're looking at what are we trying to accomplish here, right? What's the goal, right? And if we look at what the United States is trying to accomplish here, what the United States is doing right now is not stopping what Israel is doing to Gaza, right? In fact, it's gotten cover from the United States to do that. If the United States wants to stop it, then the US has to make a decision to do that. But I think Jeff is right. States tend to act in their strategic interests, right? And the strategic interest of the United States right now seems to be support for Israel. But I'll add something to that. The question, I think, is also sort of philosophical. What are states? States are people, right? All of us are the United States if we're, a citizen of this country or if we live in this country, and the same is true of any other state that's out there, right? So fundamentally, people determine what these governments actually do, right? By pressuring, by being educated, by getting sort of understanding what's actually happening, the dynamics that are here. So that's the important thing that has to be done first, because right now it's really easy to caricature the Palestinians as terrorists, as Hamas, as bloodthirsty, that want to just destroy the state of Israel, when if we look at the data, it's not that the case at all. That is just absolutely not true.
I mean, I do think we haven't talked about, there's like this whole other like regional and global strategy interest going on, which is that Iran is allied with Hezbollah and Hamas. And Iran is in a fight with the Saudis, a proxy fight, or also a direct fight in Yemen. And now Iran is allied with Russia, right? And so if you think about the strategic alliances around, it makes things complicated. The Arab states, the Gulf states are allied with Israel, and with the United States, and they were beginning to have a stronger alliance with Israel over Iran. They had a strategic shared interest in containing Iran. And so that's still there, that strategic shared interest. Whether the alliance will survive this, I don't know. But you should you should also keep in mind as you look at this, the different alliances that are going on. Hamas just appeared in Russia. I don't know if that's for show or if that's going to be something that's going to develop, right? But that's also going to be significant from the point of view of the United States. That will also be a significant development if that's more than just for show. I don't know if it is.
I feel like David will have something to add to this as a-
Yeah,
Absolutely.
no, sure. So yeah, and I study state sponsorship quite a bit. And one thing we know about sponsorship of terrorism is that, so by themselves, Hamas could only rely on their own resources. But if they have an external stream of resources coming to them, what this enables is for many of these groups, terrorists, militants, insurgents, whatever, to become more violent, to become more aggressive, to start to do things that they otherwise would not do. So this is an operation that was a very complicated one, probably required quite a bit of training, probably required a lot of bit of work, and that likely would not have been possible without Iran's activity. So then the next question is, why is Iran doing this? Well, again, consistently, if we look at Iran's behavior in the Middle East, what it does seem to be opposing is the United States and Saudi Arabia, right? That's a consistent theme of Iran's behavior throughout the Middle East. So, and they've done that in Yemen, they've done that in Iraq, they've done that elsewhere, in Lebanon as well. So from their perspective, this is a way, given that they've been isolated over the last, since the Trump administration, since the end of the JCPOA, which is the agreement the Obama administration struck with them. If they're going to be isolated, if they're going to be put under aggressive sanctions and threatened, then this is their best defense. So this is likely something that they're doing strategically. Their incentive is to continue the conflict, not necessarily to end it.
So we've reached the magical hour of 5 o'clock, and of course we could stay here forever and continue the conversation. But I want to acknowledge first of you, all of you, the audience. This is a tough topic. This is actually one of those topics that most universities, most places don't tackle and don't talk about it. And that's absolutely the opposite of what we should be doing. So this community here in this room, your now obligation to go speak with others and inform them about what is going on in the Middle East and different perspectives on the issue is tantamount to our ability to move forward. So thank you. Thank you for your role in that. And I'd like to thank my two colleagues here, Naven and Jeff, for helping us have that conversation here today. Thank you. And once again, to our co-sponsors for being here today. We really appreciate your support and the ability to all come together. So feel free to linger, ask a few questions, and thank you again for attending this evening.